The Gestapo file on Agent White Mouse grew thicker every month. 5 million francs reward, the largest bounty placed on any Allied agent in France. Hundreds of officers assigned to her capture. Maps covered the walls of Gestapo headquarters in Paris, marked with red pins showing everywhere she had been spotted. Photographs, most blurry, a few clear, were circulated to every checkpoint, every patrol, every collaborator who might recognize her. 4 times they had her cornered in apartments, safe houses, train stations. 4 times she vanished before they could close the trap. The Gestapo called emergency meetings about her. They assigned their best trackers. They offered rewards to informants. They tortured capture resistance members for any scrap of information about her identity or location. By 1944, the standing order from Gestapo headquarters was clear and desperate. Capture the White Mouse at any cost, dead or alive, with authorization for any methods necessary. They never did. The woman they hunted, the one who made fools of Germany's finest intelligence officers, who slipped through traps that had caught dozens of other agents, who seemed to have supernatural abilities to disappear, was a 32-year-old Australian socialite who had transformed herself into their worst nightmare. Her name was Nancy Wake, and this is her story told not through Allied propaganda, but through the operations she conducted, the men she led into battle, and the testimony of the German officers who spent years failing to capture her. Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born in New Zealand on August 30th, 1892, but her family moved to Sydney, Australia when she was still an infant. Her childhood was, by most accounts, unremarkable. Middle-class family, decent education, normal life in early 20th century Australia. But one quality defined Nancy from her earliest years. She was stubborn to a degree that concerned her family. When told she couldn't do something, she made it her personal mission to prove otherwise. At age 16, Nancy committed an act that scandalized her family. She ran away from home. She had saved £200, a substantial sum, by working various jobs her parents knew nothing about. With that money and a small suitcase, she simply left one morning, leaving only a note that said, "I'm going to see the world. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." She traveled, journalist assistant, translator, secretary, whatever jobs would fund the next leg of her journey. She learned to negotiate in markets where she didn't speak the language. She learned to navigate foreign cities with only crude maps. She learned to trust her instincts about people and situations. These skills, improvisation, navigation, reading people, staying calm in unfamiliar situations, would later keep her alive when the Gestapo was hunting her. By 1936, Nancy had worked her way to Paris. She was 24 years old, beautiful, in a way that turned heads, but confident enough not to care, and completely in love with the city. Paris, in the late 1930s, was the center of everything that mattered in European culture. Nancy threw herself into Parisian life with characteristic intensity. She learned French fluently within months. She attended parties with artists and writers. She worked as a freelance journalist for Australian newspapers. At one of these parties in Marseille, she met Henri Fioca. Henri was a wealthy French industrialist who owned several factories. He was older than Nancy by about 10 years, sophisticated, cultured, and immediately fascinated by this Australian woman who seemed completely unintimidated by French high society. They began courting. Within months, they were inseparable. Within a year, they were engaged. Henri's wealth meant Nancy could have lived a life of complete comfort. But Nancy's journalist work continued because she needed purpose. In 1933, Nancy traveled to Vienna on assignment. Her editor wanted stories about rising political tensions in Central Europe. What Nancy saw in Vienna would haunt her for the rest of her life. She witnessed Nazi brown shirts, paramilitary thugs in uniform, beating Jewish people in the streets. She watched it happen in broad daylight while ordinary Austrians either participated or looked away. She interviewed a Jewish shopkeeper whose store had been destroyed, who showed her scars from beatings, who spoke with resignation about what was coming. She spoke with Austrian Jews who were planning to flee if they could afford it, who understood they had no future in their own country. What Nancy saw wasn't politics or economics or abstract ideology. This was cruelty for its own sake. This was hatred made policy. She returned to Paris, shaken and angry in ways she had never experienced before. When war came in September 1939, Nancy was living comfortably in Marseille, married to Henri Fiocca. She could have sat out the war in relative safety. Henri's wealth and social connections offered protection. His factories were considered essential to the French economy. The Vichy government that collaborated with Germany would have left them alone. But Nancy couldn't forget what she had seen in Vienna. She knew what Nazi occupation meant. She couldn't remain passive. She began small. The Vichy government, the collaborationist French regime that governed southern France, was rounding up Allied soldiers who had been cut off during the German invasion of France in June 1940. These men, British, Australian, American, Polish, were being sent to prisoner of war camps. Nancy started helping them escape. Her first assisted escape was almost accidental. A British soldier knocked on her door one evening, desperate, starving, knowing only that sympathetic French people sometimes lived in expensive houses because they could afford to take risks. Nancy fed him, gave him civilian clothes, and contacted people who might know how to get him to Spain. That single act led to connections with organized escape networks. Within months, Nancy was one of the network's most active operators. The work was dangerous, but initially not deadly. Nancy used her husband's money to fund operations. She used her social connections to move through Vichy France without suspicion. A wealthy, elegant Frenchwoman visiting friends, attending parties, traveling for shopping, nobody suspected she was running an escape network. She would find soldiers hiding in the countryside, provide them with false documents, hide them in safe houses, then guide them toward the Spanish border, or pass them to guides who knew the mountain routes. By 1941, Nancy was part of a sophisticated organization. The network maintained safe houses across southern France. They had guides who knew every mountain pass through the Pyrenees. They had contacts in Spain who could get escapees to British authorities. Nancy became one of the network's most valuable assets because she could move freely through Vichy France using her social status as cover. Over 2 years, she helped more than 1,000 Allied soldiers escape. The number is documented in post-war records. 1,037 men who made it to Spain and eventually back to Allied forces. But the Gestapo noticed. Someone was moving large numbers of Allied prisoners through their territory with impressive efficiency. They began investigating. They infiltrated escape networks with informers. They tortured, captured resistance members for information. They arrested anyone remotely suspicious, and they began compiling files on people identified as network operators. Nancy's file grew. The Gestapo didn't know her real name initially. She used multiple false identities with forged papers, but they knew someone fitting her description was involved. A woman, young, elegant, French-speaking, but possibly foreign based on slight accent variations witnesses reported. She traveled frequently between Marseille, Toulouse, and areas near the Spanish border. She had money, expensive clothes, stayed in good hotels, could bribe officials when necessary. They assigned agents specifically to identify and track her. In 1942, the net began closing. One of Nancy's fellow resistance workers was captured by the Gestapo in Toulouse. They tortured him for 3 days. The man, whose name Nancy never learned, didn't reveal her identity. The Gestapo broke his body, but not his will. But he revealed enough under torture that the Gestapo intensified their search. They raided safe houses Nancy had used. They interviewed people she had contacted. They compiled better descriptions. They got closer. Nancy's first close call came in Toulouse in April 1942. She was meeting a contact at a cafe, a guide who moved people across the Pyrenees. They were discussing logistics for an upcoming escape when Nancy noticed Gestapo officers entering the cafe. They weren't there for her specifically. They were conducting random identity checks, standard procedure in occupied France, to intimidate the population and catch anyone with false papers. Nancy's papers were excellent forgeries, created by one of the best forgers in the French resistance, but they wouldn't survive detailed scrutiny from a suspicious officer. If the Gestapo took her to headquarters for verification, if they checked her identity against their growing files, she would be arrested immediately. Nancy finished her coffee calmly while the Gestapo worked their way through the cafe checking papers. When they were 3 tables away, she excused herself to use the restroom. She walked calmly, not hurrying, not looking back. She entered the restroom, immediately climbed out a window that opened to an alley, and disappeared into Toulouse's narrow streets. The Gestapo never saw her face that day. Her second escape was narrower. In June 1942, the Gestapo raided a safe house where Nancy was staying overnight. The building was in a residential neighborhood in Marseille. The Gestapo had received a tip, probably from an informer or someone who cracked under torture, that the woman they were looking for was in that specific building. They surrounded it before dawn. Nancy woke to the sound of German voices in the street and vehicles surrounding the building. She had perhaps 60 seconds before they entered the apartment. Nancy grabbed essential items, false papers, money, and hid in a bedroom closet. It was a terrible hiding place. Anyone searching thoroughly would find her immediately, but Nancy pressed herself into the back corner, behind hanging coats, and remained absolutely still. German officers searched the apartment methodically. They checked under beds, inside cupboards, behind furniture. They opened the closet where Nancy was hiding. A German officer shined a flashlight across the coats. Nancy could see light filtering through the fabric. She held her breath. The officer looked directly at where she was hidden. Then he closed the closet door and moved on. Nancy never understood why he didn't see her. Perhaps the coats concealed her better than she thought. Perhaps the officer was tired and careless. Perhaps, as Nancy believed later, she was simply lucky that day. The Gestapo searched for 2 hours before concluding the tip. Was wrong, or the target had already fled. They left. Nancy waited in the closet for an additional 2 hours before emerging. She learned later that the Gestapo had received specific intelligence that the White Mouse, they had started using that nickname because she kept slipping their traps, was in that building. They had been specifically hunting for her. By autumn 1942, Nancy's face was in Gestapo files. They still didn't know her real name, but they had descriptions from multiple witnesses and a few photographs, mostly blurry shots taken by informers. They called her the White Mouse in their reports because she slipped through traps that caught others. The bounty on her head increased incrementally as frustration mounted at headquarters. Initially 1 million francs, then 2 million. By late 1942, 3 million francs. By early 1943, 5 million francs, the highest bounty placed on any Allied agent in France. Henri Fiocca begged Nancy to stop. The danger had escalated to the point where continuing seemed like deliberate suicide. But Nancy refused. She had seen what the Nazis did in Vienna. She knew what they would do in France if they consolidated power. She knew that every soldier she helped escape would potentially fight again, help liberate France, contribute to defeating the regime she despised. She couldn't stop while she could still make a difference. The third escape came in December 1942 and was the most devastating personally. The Gestapo raided Henri's home in Marseille. Nancy wasn't there. She was on an operation near the Spanish border, guiding a group of soldiers to the mountain passes. But the Gestapo found evidence. Radio equipment hidden in a basement room, false documents in various names, maps of escape routes marked with safe houses, money, large amounts in various currencies. They arrested Henri. They knew he wasn't the primary operator, his age, his social position, his business commitments made it unlikely he was the active agent. But they knew his wife was. They tortured Henri for information. They wanted her name, her contacts, her methods, her patterns. Henri told them nothing. The Gestapo broke his fingers. He told them nothing. They beat him unconscious repeatedly. He told them nothing. They kept him imprisoned for 10 months. In October 1943, frustrated by his refusal to cooperate and needing to clear space in their detention facilities, they executed Henri Fiocca by firing squad. Nancy didn't learn of Henri's death for months. She was in hiding after the raid on their home, moving constantly through the resistance network, knowing the Gestapo had her description and were actively hunting her. She learned of the arrest shortly after it happened, but communication in occupied France was unreliable. News traveled slowly. She didn't learn of Henri's execution until early 1944, by which time she was already in England, training to return to France as a professional intelligence agent rather than an improvised resistance worker. After the raid on Henri's home, Nancy knew she had to leave France. The Gestapo had her description, her known associates, her operational patterns. Every checkpoint had her photograph. Every informer had been shown her picture. She couldn't operate effectively anymore. Staying meant certain capture. She had to escape to England, receive proper training, and return with official backing rather than operating as an independent resistance worker. Escaping France in 1942 was extremely difficult. The Spanish border was heavily guarded. The Pyrenees mountain passes were patrolled by both German forces and Spanish border guards. Many attempting to cross were captured. Many more died from exposure in winter conditions. Nancy had helped hundreds of others make this crossing, arranging guides, providing supplies, coordinating timing. Now she had to do it herself. Her first escape attempt came in January 1943. She and a guide left from a safe house near Perpignan, approaching the mountains from the Mediterranean side. They traveled at night, hiding during the day. 3 days into the journey, as they approached the border, a German patrol spotted them. The patrol had dogs. Escape by outrunning them was impossible. Nancy and her guide fled higher into the mountains, moving through snow and ice, the dogs and soldiers following. They eventually found a cave, barely a depression in the rock face, and hid there. The cave was shallow enough that if the Germans searched thoroughly, they would be found. But Nancy and her guide remained absolutely silent and motionless for 2 days while the patrol searched the area. They had no food. The temperature was well below freezing. They couldn't risk a fire. The smoke would alert the patrol. Nancy later described those 2 days as among the worst of her life, not because of the physical discomfort, though that was extreme, but because she was trapped, helpless, waiting to be discovered. Every sound outside the cave might be soldiers finding them. For someone who valued action and control as much as Nancy did, the forced passivity was psychologically devastating. The patrol finally gave up and moved to other sectors. Nancy and her guide, frostbitten and exhausted, returned to the safe house network. The escape had failed. Her second attempt came in March 1943. She joined a group of refugees and Allied soldiers attempting a crossing from a different location near the town of Bagno-sur-Mer. The guide was one of the best, a French Basque who knew the mountains better than anyone and had successfully guided dozens of groups across. The journey would take 6 days through high mountain passes to reach the Spanish town of Figueras. The group left before dawn. There were 14 people: Nancy, 3 other resistance workers escaping Gestapo pursuit, 7 Allied soldiers, 4 British, 2 Australian, 1 American, and 3 guides. They traveled at night and hid during the day. The pace was brutal. The guides set a speed that left the less fit members gasping. But the guides were right. Speed meant fewer hours exposed in dangerous territory. Slow meant more chance of patrol encounters. On the 3rd day, as they crossed a partially frozen river, disaster struck. The ice looked solid but wasn't. Nancy stepped onto what appeared to be stable ice over a deep section. The ice broke. She plunged into freezing water over her head. The current immediately began pulling her downstream. If she went under completely, the cold would kill her in minutes. 2 of the guides grabbed her and pulled her out. She was soaked, freezing, in shock. The guides faced an impossible decision. Making a fire would alert patrols, the smoke visible for miles. But leaving Nancy in wet clothes in sub-zero temperatures would kill her through hypothermia within hours. They compromised by wringing out her clothes as much as possible and giving her dry clothes from others in the group. Everyone contributing something, so no single person was left too exposed. Then they forced Nancy to walk. Hard, fast walking generates body heat. Nancy walked for 8 more hours in barely dry clothes, through snow and ice. She survived through sheer physical resilience and stubbornness. They reached Spain on the 6th day, but crossing the border didn't mean safety. Spain was officially neutral, but leaned toward Germany. Spanish authorities arrested anyone entering illegally. The entire group was taken to a Spanish prison in Figueras. The conditions were harsh: overcrowded cells, minimal food, no heat. Nancy spent 6 weeks there before British authorities negotiated her release. She finally reached England in May 1943. Exhausted, traumatized by Henri's capture, she didn't yet know he was dead, but determined to return to France with proper training and support. British intelligence debriefed Nancy extensively. They were impressed. Her experience running escape networks under Gestapo pursuit was valuable. Her ability to operate under pressure was proven. Her knowledge of southern France, of resistance networks, of German security procedures, all of this made her exceptionally valuable. They recruited her into the Special Operations Executive, SOE, a secret organization conducting espionage, sabotage, and support for resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. SOE training was designed to be brutal. The assumption was that you would be operating alone in enemy territory, constantly hunted, with no support if captured. Torture was assumed if caught. Death was likely. The training reflected these realities. Instructors pushed trainees to their physical and psychological limits. The washout rate was approximately 40%. Many couldn't handle the psychological pressure even before reaching operational deployment. Nancy thrived. Physical training, running, hiking with heavy loads, hand-to-hand combat suited someone who had spent 2 years scrambling through mountains helping soldiers escape. Weapons training covered everything from pistols to submachine guns to explosives. Nancy proved to be a good shot with any weapon. Sabotage training taught destruction techniques for railways, bridges, communication lines. Radio operation training emphasized both technical skills and security procedures. German direction-finding units could locate radio transmissions within minutes if operators weren't careful. Hand-to-hand combat training was particularly important for women agents. SOE instructors recognized that women couldn't rely on physical strength against male opponents. Instead, they taught techniques emphasizing speed, surprise, and targeting vulnerable points. Nancy learned to kill with her hands if necessary, techniques she would later use in combat. Parachute training terrified Nancy initially. Jumping from aircraft into darkness, trusting that a parachute would deploy correctly, violated every survival instinct. But after the first jump, she found it exhilarating. The brief freefall, the sudden jerk as the parachute deployed, the silent descent through darkness. It was freedom in a way that appealed to someone who valued control and independence. One instructor's assessment of Nancy, preserved in SOE files, discovered after the war, noted excellent physical condition despite age 32, considered old for field operatives. Fearless to a degree that may indicate recklessness, but appears to be calculated risk-taking rather than actual carelessness. Extremely stubborn, will not accept failure or retreat from challenges. Strong leadership qualities. Other trainees respond well to her. Recommended for deployment as organizer rather than courier. Can handle herself in combat situations. Assessment. Excellent operational potential. Nancy completed training in January 1944. By this time, Allied planning for D-Day, the invasion of France, was well advanced. SOE's role would be coordinating resistance groups to conduct sabotage operations that would slow German reinforcements moving to counter the invasion. Nancy's mission: parachute into central France, organize and lead Maquis resistance fighters in the Auvergne region, coordinate operations to support D-Day. On February 29, 1944, a leap year, Nancy parachuted into France. The operation was timed for a moonlit night to allow the pilot to navigate and the reception committee on the ground to signal the drop zone. Nancy jumped from approximately 1,200 feet. Her parachute deployed correctly. She drifted down through the darkness toward a field in the Auvergne region where resistance fighters waited with flashlights to guide her landing. Her parachute caught in a tree. This was a common hazard. Winds were unpredictable and trees were everywhere in rural France. Nancy hung, suspended approximately 15 feet above the ground, tangled in the parachute harness, unable to free herself. The reception committee, 3 Maquis fighters, ran to help. They cut her down and welcomed her with nervous excitement. Nancy's first words, delivered in fluent French with a slight accent: "I hope all your trees have me hanging from them." The men laughed. The ice was broken. Nancy had arrived. The reality of leading Maquis fighters was more challenging than SOE training had suggested. Nancy found approximately 3,500 men scattered across forests and remote mountains in the Auvergne region. They were brave but disorganized, inadequately armed, and poorly trained for military operations. These were not professional soldiers. They were young men hiding from German forced labor conscription, escaped prisoners of war, deserters from Vichy forces, farmers who had killed collaborators and fled to the forests, political radicals avoiding arrest. What they had in common was determination to fight Germans, but little else. Many groups were rivals competing for limited British supply drops. Some were communists who distrusted non-communist organizers. Others were Gaullists loyal to Charles de Gaulle who refused to cooperate with communists. Regional loyalties caused conflicts. Personal feuds between leaders created factions. Nancy's job was to unite them into an effective fighting force capable of coordinated operations. She did it through personal force and leading by example. Nancy didn't ask the Maquis to do anything she wouldn't do herself. She hiked through mountains carrying weapons and supplies alongside them. She shared their food or went hungry when there wasn't enough. She participated in combat operations. When disputes arose between communist and Gaullist groups, she mediated by pointing out that the Germans were the enemy, not each other, and internal conflicts helped only the Germans. Gradually, the different Maquis groups began cooperating. The weapon shortage was critical. The Maquis needed rifles, machine guns, explosives, and ammunition to conduct effective operations. These could only come from British supply drops, but drops were infrequent, often missed their targets, and dangerous. German patrols watched for drop zones and would ambush Maquis trying to collect supplies. Radio communication with London was essential to coordinate drops, but radios were scarce and German. Direction-finding units actively hunted radio operators. Nancy's radio operator, a young French SOE agent named Denny, was killed in a German attack shortly after she arrived. A patrol stumbled onto the Maquis camp where Dennis was transmitting. He tried to hide his radio and escape, but was shot. Without radio contact, Nancy couldn't request supply drops or report intelligence to London. The Maquis operations would collapse without supplies. Nancy needed to contact another SOE group with a working radio. The nearest SOE group with confirmed radio capability was approximately 250 kilometers away, near Châteauroux. Nancy made a decision that became legendary among SOE operations. She would personally bicycle there to send messages to London, 250 kilometers through German-occupied France, over mountainous terrain, carrying false papers, with the Gestapo still maintaining a 5 million franc bounty on her head and her photograph circulated to every checkpoint. Most SOE officers would consider this mission impossible. Nancy considered it necessary. She left before dawn on a stolen bicycle. The bicycle was heavy, pre-war construction, with no gears. Pedaling uphill meant standing on the pedals and grinding forward. She carried minimal supplies, false papers identifying her as a farm worker, a small amount of money, a concealed pistol. She wore rough peasant clothes that made her look like any other rural French woman cycling to market or visiting relatives. The journey required over 36 hours of continuous cycling with only brief rest stops. Nancy navigated by memory and crude maps. She avoided main roads where German patrols were more common, instead using rural lanes and farm tracks. This added distance but reduced risk. Several times she had to hide when hearing German vehicles approaching. Once she hid in a roadside ditch while a convoy of trucks passed meters away. She passed through 3 German checkpoints. Each time her heart raced, but her expression remained calm and bored. A farm worker on a long bicycle trip was too ordinary to warrant suspicion. At one checkpoint near Montluçon, a German officer studied her papers more carefully than the others. He asked her destination, Nancy gave the name of a village near Château and explained she was visiting sick relatives. The officer studied her face. Nancy met his eyes without flinching, keeping her expression neutral and slightly annoyed at the delay. The officer handed back her papers and waved her through. Nancy pedaled on her legs, screaming from exhaustion, but maintaining a steady pace that wouldn't attract attention. She reached the other SOE group late on the second day. The operators were shocked to see her. They had assumed radio silence meant her network had been compromised and she was dead or captured. Nancy transmitted her messages to London, requests for supply drops, intelligence on German troop movements, confirmation of her operational status. Then she had to bicycle back, another 250 kilometers. The return journey took slightly longer because Nancy was already exhausted from the outbound trip. When she returned to her Maquis camp 3 days after leaving, she could barely walk. Her legs had seized up so badly that other fighters had to help her off the bicycle. She had worn through the bicycle seat and had open wounds from saddle sores. Her hands were blistered from gripping the handlebars. She was dehydrated and hadn't eaten adequately for 3 days. But she had maintained contact with London and arranged for supply drops to resume. The men she led were astonished. They had heard stories about her escaping the Gestapo 4 times, about her crossing the Pyrenees in winter, about her surviving SOE training. But this, witnessing her return from what should have been an impossible mission, earned their absolute loyalty. One Maquis fighter later said in a post-war interview, "We called her the Madonna of the Maquis. After that bicycle ride, we had heard she was tough. Now we had seen it ourselves. After that, if she asked us to attack hell itself, we would have followed her." As D-Day approached, Nancy's mission expanded dramatically. She had to organize Maquis groups to conduct sabotage operations that would slow German reinforcements moving to Normandy after the invasion began. This meant coordinating operations across hundreds of square kilometers involving thousands of fighters who had never worked together before. Railways had to be destroyed at multiple points simultaneously to prevent repairs from restoring service quickly. Roads had to be blocked with explosives and fallen trees. Communication lines, telephone and telegraph, had to be cut. German convoys had to be ambushed. And all of this had to be coordinated so operations occurred when they would have maximum impact. Nancy proved to be a natural military leader despite having no formal military training beyond SOE preparation. She organized the Maquis into structured units with clear command hierarchies. She established supply distribution systems to ensure weapons and ammunition reached the groups who needed them. She created intelligence networks to track German movements and identify targets. She personally led weapons training, teaching fighters how to use British-supplied Sten guns, how to throw grenades effectively, how to set explosives. By June 1944, Nancy was effectively commanding approximately 7,000 fighters spread across the Auvergne region. This made her one of the most powerful Allied commanders in central France. The number seems impossible. How could one woman coordinate that many irregular fighters? But Nancy had help from local resistance leaders who commanded individual groups. Her role was coordination, planning, and leadership, and she had earned the respect necessary to make that coordination work. One incident from this period demonstrated both Nancy's combat capabilities and her willingness to do what was necessary. During a raid on a German garrison near Montluçon, Nancy's unit was ambushed by a German patrol that had been alerted to the attack. The fighting was close quarters and chaotic. At one point, a German SS officer broke through the Maquis line and charged directly at Nancy's position. She was firing a Sten gun, providing covering fire for retreating fighters. The SS officer was armed with a pistol and closing fast. Nancy's Sten gun jammed, a common problem with these weapons under rapid-fire conditions. The SS officer was meters away. Nancy dropped the Sten and attacked him with her bare hands. The fight was brief and brutal. The SS officer was larger and stronger, but Nancy had been trained by SOE instructors in hand-to-hand combat techniques designed specifically for physical mismatches. She used his momentum against him, targeted vulnerable points, and killed him using techniques that SOE had drilled into her until they became instinct. When asked about it later by American journalists after the war, Nancy said simply and without emotion, "He was trying to kill me. I killed him first. That's war. There's no honor in it, no glory. You do what you must to survive. I've killed Germans. I don't enjoy it. I don't regret it. It was necessary." After D-Day on June 6th, Nancy's Maquis conducted continuous operations. They destroyed railways between central France and Normandy at over 20 locations, using explosives on bridges, tearing up tracks, demolishing signal stations. German engineers would repair one section, and the Maquis would destroy another. This forced the Germans to move reinforcements by road, which was slower and more vulnerable to air attack. They ambushed German convoys moving north toward the Normandy battlefield. Using intelligence from local civilians who reported German movements, Nancy's fighters would set up ambushes on rural roads, felling trees to block the road, positioning fighters in concealed positions on both sides, waiting until the convoy was trapped. These ambushes were risky. German convoys often had armored vehicles and automatic weapons, but conducted at night or dawn, planned carefully, with the advantage of surprise, they were effective. The Maquis would strike, inflict casualties, and disappear into the forests before German reinforcements arrived. They captured approximately 1,400 German soldiers between June and August 1944. Some surrendered after their units were ambushed and cut off. Others were captured during raids on isolated garrisons. The Maquis had no facilities for holding prisoners, so captured Germans were disarmed and turned over to advancing Allied forces, or, in some cases, simply disarmed and released with warnings not to continue fighting. Nancy enforced strict rules against executing prisoners, partly from moral conviction, partly from practical recognition that mistreating prisoners would lead to German reprisals against French civilians. The Gestapo intensified their efforts to capture Nancy during this period. They knew a female SOE agent was operating in the Auvergne. German intelligence had intercepted some of her radio communications and knew she was coordinating resistance operations. They conducted sweeps through suspected Maquis areas, arresting civilians on suspicion of helping the resistance, burning villages believed to shelter fighters. Several times the Gestapo nearly captured Nancy. Once, German forces surrounded a village where she was meeting with Maquis leaders to plan operations. Nancy escaped by disguising herself as an elderly peasant woman. Hunched posture, headscarf covering her face, rough peasant dress, and walked past German soldiers conducting house-to-house searches. They didn't recognize her. She spent 2 days hiding in the forests before rejoining her unit. Another time, the Gestapo raided a farmhouse where Nancy was sleeping. She woke to the sound of German voices and vehicle engines outside. She had 30 seconds to decide, hide or run. The farmhouse had no good hiding places. Nancy ran, jumping through a window and sprinting into nearby woods as German soldiers entered the house. They pursued, but lost her in the darkness and dense forest. She spent 3 days in the forest without food, drinking from streams, before making her way back to the Maquis camp. Her final escape from German forces came in July 1944. German units, approximately 1,000 soldiers supported by artillery, surrounded a Maquis camp where Nancy was headquartered. The Germans had received intelligence about the camp's location from captured resistance members under torture. The attack came at dawn with artillery bombardment followed by infantry assault. The Germans expected to overrun the camp quickly. The Maquis had perhaps 300 fighters against 1,000 German soldiers. But Nancy had anticipated this scenario and prepared defensive plans. Rather than attempting to hold fixed positions, the Maquis fought a fighting retreat through the forests, conducting ambushes and delaying actions, making the Germans pay for every meter of advance while gradually withdrawing to pre-planned positions. Nancy commanded one of the rearguard units covering the retreat. She fired a Brand-Light machine gun until the barrel overheated, then grabbed the rifle and kept fighting. At one point, German forces were close enough that she could hear their officers shouting orders. But the Maquis escaped with minimal casualties. Approximately 15 wounded, 3 killed. The Germans suffered over 200 killed or wounded according to their own casualty reports captured after the war. It was a tactical defeat for the Germans, but a strategic success for the Maquis, who preserved their fighting force to continue operations. The war in France ended for Nancy in August 1944, when Allied forces moving from Normandy and from the Mediterranean coast liberated her area of operations. Her Maquis fighters emerged from the forests to join regular French forces pursuing retreating Germans. Nancy's war should have ended there. She had survived 3 years of operations, escaped capture 4 times, led thousands of fighters, achieved her mission, but she volunteered for additional operations, hoping to deploy to the Pacific theater to fight against Japan. The atomic bombs ended the Pacific War before she could deploy again. Nancy returned to England in late 1944. It was there, in a formal debriefing session, that she learned Henri was dead. She had known he was arrested. That news had reached her in 1943, but she had hoped he might survive in a prisoner camp until liberation. Learning that the Gestapo had executed him in October 1943 devastated her in ways combat never had. Henri had been arrested because of her activities. He had been tortured for information about her. He had revealed nothing and they had killed him. Nancy blamed herself. The British government awarded Nancy the George Medal, one of Britain's highest civilian decorations for gallantry. The French government awarded her 3 Croix de Guerre, France's military decoration for valor, and the Médaille de la Résistance. The American government awarded her the Medal of Freedom with bronze palm. She became the most decorated servicewoman of World War II. At the award ceremonies, Nancy wore her medals and smiled for photographs. But privately, she told France she would trade every medal to have Henri back alive. The Gestapo files on the White Mouse were discovered by Allied forces in Paris after liberation. Officers examining captured German records found Nancy's file in the Gestapo's headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch. The file contained over 300 pages, reports from agents assigned to track her photographs, most blurry, a few quite clear, descriptions compiled from witness statements, maps of places she had been seen marked with dates, interrogation reports from captured resistance members asked about her, casualty reports from Maquis operations she conducted. The file documented the Gestapo's obsession with capturing the White Mouse. It also documented their complete and humiliating failure. One German intelligence officer who had been assigned to the White Mouse case was interviewed after the war by British intelligence. He remembered it clearly. "We knew There was a woman operating major escape networks and later coordinating resistance operations. We assigned dozens of our best people to find her. Every time we thought we had her location, she was gone before we could close the trap. After a while, capturing the White Mouse became more than an operational necessity. It became a matter of professional pride. We had to prove we could catch her. We never did. Looking back with the perspective of years, I don't think we ever really had a chance against her. She was too smart, too careful, and I think too lucky. Nancy's post-war life was difficult and troubled. She tried to return to Australia but found she didn't fit in civilian society anymore. She had spent years living on adrenaline, constantly in danger, making life or death decisions daily. Peacetime, civilian life felt empty and pointless. She moved to London, then back to Australia, then to England again, searching for something she could never quite define. She married twice more, but neither marriage lasted. The men couldn't understand what the war had done to her, and Nancy couldn't explain it in ways that made sense to people who hadn't experienced it. She worked various jobs, but nothing satisfied her. She lived modestly despite her fame. She gave occasional interviews, but generally avoided publicity and declined to participate in television documentaries about the resistance. She lived quietly, troubled by memories, mourning Henri, unable to escape the war, even decades after it ended. In interviews during the 1990s and 2000s, when she was in her 80s and 90s, elderly Nancy spoke with brutal honesty about her war experiences. She didn't glorify combat or romanticize resistance work. She described it as terrifying, exhausting, and morally complicated. She had killed people. She knew that with certainty. Some were soldiers fighting for Germany who probably had no choice. Some were evil men who deserved death. War didn't allow for easy moral judgments. You did what was necessary to survive and achieve your mission. You lived with the consequences. When asked about the Gestapo's 5 million franc bounty, Nancy said with her characteristic dry humor, "I was very expensive. I hope I was worth the investment to the British government. I certainly made the Germans pay a high price for trying to catch me." When asked if she had regrets about her war service, she said, "I regret Henri's death. That is my one great regret. He died because of my activities. He was tortured and killed, protecting me. I carry that guilt every day. Everything else, the danger, the fear, the killing, those things were necessary. We were fighting genuine evil, not the abstract philosophical kind, but the kind that beats people in streets and builds death camps. If I had to do it all again, I would make the same choices. But I wish Henri had survived. That's what I wish." Nancy Wake died on August 7th, 2011, in London at a nursing home. She was 98 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep. A gentle death she had not expected during the war, when violent death seemed far more likely. In accordance with her wishes, her ashes were scattered in the mountains of central France, the Auvergne region, where she had commanded her Maquis fighters 67 years earlier. The story of Nancy Wake is ultimately a story about what ordinary people can accomplish when circumstances demand extraordinary action. She wasn't a professional soldier or trained intelligence officer when the war began. She was a journalist who saw injustice and decided to fight it. She became the Gestapo's most wanted person not because she had supernatural abilities, but because she was stubborn, brave, smart, and refused to give up even when logic said she should. The German officers who hunted her wrote in their reports that the White Mouse seemed to have supernatural abilities to appear and disappear, to be always one step ahead of capture. But there was nothing supernatural about Nancy Wake. She survived because she was careful, because she took calculated risks rather than foolish ones, because she understood that in occupied France the price of one mistake was death, and because she was unwilling to make that mistake. The 5 million francs the Gestapo offered for her Capture represented dozens of agents deployed to hunt her, thousands of hours investigating her activities, hundreds of raids on suspected safe houses and resistance locations. They never collected that bounty. Nancy walked away from the war alive, decorated by 3 governments and unbowed by an enemy that had captured and killed so many others. The Germans, who hunted her most relentlessly, did not survive the war, or survived only to see their regime defeated by the very resistance forces they had tried to crush. That is the measure of Nancy Wake. Not the medals she received, or the bounty placed on her head, or the operations she conducted, or the men she commanded. The measure is that she saw evil and chose to fight it, knowing she would probably die but fighting anyway. And when the war finally ended, she was still standing, while many who had hunted her were not. She survived, she prevailed, and she never surrendered. The Gestapo called her the White Mouse. The Maquis called her the Madonna. History remembers her as one of the great resistance fighters of the Second World War. But Nancy would have said she was just a woman who got very angry about injustice and refused to be beaten. Sometimes that's all heroism really is.